Hello everyone, welcome to SPI's 5th webinar. Today we have a very special event for you, a panel discussion on things that you might know and hopefully a lot of things that you don't know about charitable fundraising and the economics of charity. I would like to introduce briefly the panel now. To my left we have Anya, Michael Price, and Robert Metcalfe. So to begin today, we want to show you a video of SPI that will just take roughly 30 or 45 seconds.
With fundraising, it's never good to leave money on the table. But now, charities can use scientific methods to increase donations, and the University of Chicago's Science of Philanthropy Initiative can help. SPI researchers across the globe have made powerful discoveries by using randomized control trials to study fundraising strategies. This is the same approach a medical researcher uses to find a cure. For example, they've shown that appealing to the good feelings associated with giving is more effective than appealing to the desire to help a cause. So you can increase donations simply by changing the way a solicitation is worded. A great way to start planning your fundraising campaign is to attend conferences, read scientific studies, and consult resources such as the Science of Philanthropy Initiative, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. But since each charity is unique, it's best to run a campaign that's been optimized specifically for your organization. And you don't have to do it alone. Through science-based testing, SPI helps to determine the most effective ways for your charity to raise money. So check out the Science of Philanthropy Initiative and see how science can make a difference for your next fundraising campaign.
Welcome back. So today we are going to start with Michael Price. He will give us a 20-minute discussion on match dollars and how some of the conventional wisdom that all of you believe to be true just might not be true. So along the way here, if you'd like to send in questions, we will take questions at the very end of Michael's talk, and after that we will go to our second panelist. So without further ado, I give you Michael Price.
Thank you, John. So what I'm going to talk about is evidence looking at how do matching gifts affect charitable giving. And as John said, if you think of the sort of conventional wisdom, I really like this quote because I think this kind of gives how people tend to think about a matching gift. Obviously, a 1-to-1 match is more appealing than a 1-to-2 challenge. And a richer challenge, 2-to-1, greatly adds to the match's attractiveness. So if you think about the general sentiment on this, it's kind of, as the economists were thinking of this, it's saying, you know, the lower the cost is of giving, so larger matches are lowering the cost to you of giving, extending the impact of your gift, the more attractive that match is. So it's really getting this idea that it's akin to sort of changes in prices. So, but does the match rate really matter? So I want to start talking about some work that John did with Dean Carlin, where they partnered with a liberal nonprofit that focuses on political and socially oriented work. This was a mail campaign where they varied both the presence of a match and the underlying match rate. And the question here is trying to get at, does the match rate itself matter, or is it simply providing a match that matters? The way that they set this up, it was 50,000 households, and the randomization households were split into one of 4 groups. There was a control group that simply received a letter that was asking them to give, no mention of a match. There was a group that received a 1-to-1 match, second group that received a 2-to-1 match, so what should be viewed as a more attractive match. And then the third group, they even tried to further increase the attractiveness, given the conventional wisdom, by setting the match rate at 3-to-1. So what are the findings? The presence of the match itself matters. So simply having a matching gift available to a donor increased the amount of money raised by approximately 19%. Now, where is this coming from? It was coming predominantly from increases in the likelihood of people giving. So if you look at the likelihood of receiving a contribution, it was about 22% higher amongst those who were receiving the match. So right now it looks like, great, the match works. But if you think of the question, does the match rate itself matter? The answer is no. And in fact, if you look across the likelihood of giving or out-of-pocket contributions, so thinking about the amount that the donor themselves is giving, there's no difference across the control group or any of the match rates. So of course, when you add in the match, higher match rates, you're getting more dollars coming in, but the out-of-pocket, what the donor themselves are doing, are incredibly unresponsive to changes in the match rate. So what about other forms of matches? So you can say, okay, if you think about the typical matching campaign, it's a linear, it's some kind of 1-to-1, 2-to-1. But if you think of what companies do or what businesses do, there are other kinds of price reductions that one could offer. So you could think of things like a buy one, get one free type offer, or a buy one, get the second at half off. You also have that firms may offer things like a gift card, right? And the idea on the gift card is this is money that can only be spent at that store or at that company. So if you think about these types of strategies, these are akin to what we would consider to be sort of nonlinear matches. So Stephen Huck and Imran Rasool said, okay, if we want to think about matching, maybe linear matches can be outperformed by these nonlinear matches. And can we take insights from what the for-profits do to look at these different types of nonlinear match schemes. They did this with the Bavarian Opera House. In their design, it was 25,000 individuals. All of these individuals had attended the opera in the past year, and they randomized them into one of 6 groups. They had 2 linear match rate schemes, a 1-to-1 and a 1-to-2. So here they're actually lowering the match rate on it. They had a constant match of $20 for any donation made. So this is akin to the gift card, right? The idea is if I give something, I now have this added dollars coming in. They also implement one where they match all donations above £50 or €50 at a 1-to-1 rate. And then as a control saying, okay, let's try to disentangle, is this coming through sort of changes in the prices of giving? Or is it coming through signaling or sending some information about the fact that somebody else has provided this match, so they're supporting this charity and they may have better information than I do? They have a final treatment where they're just announcing a leadership gift. So let's look first at rates of giving across these. So this leverage gift, this idea of any gift we will contribute a fixed amount to, that leads to increased rates of participation relative to simply asking or the seed money announcement. The linear matches have no discernible impact on rates of giving. So here they're finding that there's actually no change in the likelihood that people are giving by simply announcing a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 match. And these conditional matches, so we'll match dollar or euro for euro any contribution over 50, are leading to higher rates of giving than those who are offered or observe the seed announcement, and of course higher than those that were in the control. Now if we think of out-of-pocket expenditures. So here leverage gifts have no impact on out-of-pocket donation amounts. So they're great at getting people in to give, but it's having no impact on how much they're giving once they make the decision to give. Linear and conditional matches do affect the amount given. Here it's about a 25 to 33% increase in out-of-pocket expenditures. But relative to those who observed a seed money announcement, this increase is substantially smaller. So those who saw the seed money announcement, it was an approximate doubling of their out-of-pocket gifts relative to those in the control. So if you think about why does the match work here? Okay? Saying linear match schemes, well, relative to simply announcing a leadership gift, they seem, their promise is questionable, right? And one way of thinking of this is that there's a diminished value of a quality signal, and this leads to lower out-of-pocket giving. Nonlinear match rates hold some promise. This is similar to the idea of what you observe when you have these buy one, get one free type deals. And what's happening if you really look at the distribution of gifts or how the gifts are coming in, you're crowding in at this kink point. So people are giving precisely $50 to get the match. But you're not getting a change in the number of givers. So it's good that you can move how much they're giving. It's a little bit harder to get people coming in to it. So if you think of this jointly, it's really leading to a story where matches are affecting behavior through sending a signal of quality. So the idea that you have somebody who has provided this matching gift is signaling, wow, this is a cause that we should get behind. If somebody else is supporting it at this level and is trying to increase the impact of our gifts, are willing to make that investment, this must be a cause worth getting behind. So this got us thinking about a new idea. And if you think about matching grants, it shares similarity with match contributions in the retirement savings world. And in that literature and in that world, if you think about it, there's been a lot of work that is saying, well, if we want to increase savings, there's a couple levers that we can think about working upon. One is, let's change the amount, the threshold that we'll match savings up to. The other is to think about the rate at which we will match it. Okay? So now we want to say, does this work? Does this have a similar impact if we think about charitable giving and matching gifts in charitable giving? So the way that we set this up is we said, okay, what if we match all donations up to some dollar amount X? And so here we're going to introduce the threshold, and now we're going to say, what if we change the threshold and change the rate at which we match? So the idea is saying, suppose that we have a donor who is willing to give $1 million for a matching gifts. One way you could say, okay, we could match this 2-to-1 up to some amount, or we could try to extend this by saying we'll match it at a lower rate, but increase the threshold that we would match to. So you could think of provide a 1-to-1 match on all gifts up to 2x, as opposed to 2-to-1 match on all gifts up to x. So you would still have the same amount of match dollars coming in, but can you use this trick, changing this threshold and the match rate, to increase out-of-pocket donations coming from the donors themselves? To implement this, we partnered with the Environmental Defense Fund during their summer fundraising drive. This was an email solicitation sent to nearly 200,000 individuals, where we randomized them into one of 4 groups, both 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 linear match schemes. So here was 2-to-1 on any dollar given, 1-to-1 match on any dollar given. We had a 2-to-1 match rate on every dollar up to $25. We selected 25. That was the median gift for this segment of their donor pool from the previous summer's campaign. Then the final treatment was a 1-to-1 match on every dollar up to 50. So does the match rate here matter? So we're going to go back to this question, does the match rate itself matter? And if you look at it, both rates of giving and average contributions were lower for this population in the 1-to-1 unlimited match treatment. They were about 35% less likely to give, and the average gifts were approximately 33% lower than counterparts who were offered a 2-to-1 match on all dollars. So it appears that at least for this group, there's an increased sensitivity to the match rate, and this was driven largely by those who had given in the past year. But we aren't interested only in this linear match. We're also interested in what happens as we change not only the match rate, but as we introduce thresholds. So now we want to look at what happens as we're changing the threshold. And in fact, we find for the subset of lapsed or prospect donors, the 1-to-1 up to $50 is in fact the most effective treatment, relative to what we observed in the 2-to-1 on every dollar given treatment. Those who are offered 1-to-1 match up to $50 were approximately 6% more likely to give and provided average gifts that were about 10% higher. If we compare that to the 2-to-1 match up to $25, the differences are slightly smaller, but they're still significant. So some takeaway thoughts on how we interpret what's going on here. We take this as saying, rather than matching gifts working through changing the price or extending the impact of your gift, it's really working through that it's sending a signal of charitable quality. So you see increases in both giving, rates of giving, and average contributions, and particularly amongst those who are prospect donors or lapsed donors who haven't given in a while. When you're thinking about those who have been recently engaged, so warm-less donors, the impact of matches is much less pronounced. Well, here that's constant with a model of signal, where you're saying somebody who's engaged and continually engaged probably has better information or better sense of what this charity is about, what the cause is about that we're supporting, than somebody who you're trying to attract for the first time or who hasn't given in years to your cause. However, when we think about these nonlinear and these thresholds changing it, even amongst warmless donors, there's some promise here in that, as we saw with John and the Carlin and List study, where you have no change in out-of-pocket giving, or maybe even some slight crowding of out-of-pocket giving as you change the match rate. With these thresholds, you don't have this, you don't see the same type of crowding. So it's a way to ensure that dollars that are coming in and the match themselves are additional, not crowding out other dollars. So again, I think that the takeaway is saying it's not working through this idea that higher matches are necessarily good because they are lowering the cost of giving or they're increasing the impact of a dollar that you as the donor give. Rather, if they are having an impact, it's coming through a larger match, sends a higher signal. It's a better signal of charitable quality, and that really the impact is coming through quality signals.
So are we ready to go? Okay, so Michael, thank you very much. Now, if anyone has questions, please send them in. We have our first question from Melissa Brown. And the question is there any follow-up yet on renewal gifts from the donors responding to the match offer? And I'm going to throw that out to Michael for our very first question. Melissa, thank you very much.
So far, everything that has looked at the impact of matching has looked at it in the contemporaneous context, that fundraising campaign. There is some evidence that is starting to come in. We have some work that we've done with Maryville College where we're looking at matches, and the question there was to get people to progress up from one level of a donor society to the next. And we were starting to get the data in now on repeat giving, the following year's campaign. Were they continuing to give at the previous level that we matched them up to, or do they revert back to the old? But as far as I've seen, there's very little evidence. Really, the focus has been on what is the best way to organize a match for that current campaign, and much less work on what are the impacts over the longer run.
Yeah, and I think what that leads into, Melissa, your question is excellent in the sense that as academics, and I think all of you as practitioners, are interested in when we develop a killer fundraising campaign, and you can think of the Ice Bucket Challenge, for example, are those new dollars that actually come into the charitable market, or are we simply stealing the dollars that would be going to a different charity? From your perspective, it might be great either way. It's more money into your cause. But of course, all of you are interested as well in the question, when we have matched dollars, when we have seed money, does that actually enhance the overall pie, or are we just stealing money from each other? And right now, there's no good answer to that question. I think that ends up being one of the most important questions that we are facing at SPI, and we have 2 or 3, so to speak, hooks in the water to try to answer that question. And I think within a year or two, we will have some very good answers to that very important question. Okay, so I'm going to now go to question number 2. And this is from, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Banu, asks, why would the 2-to-1 offer be extended to the lower dollar amount?
So here, the idea that we were thinking of on it was, suppose that you have a lead donor who says, I will match up to $1 million worth of donations coming in. What we wanted to look at is saying, okay, if you have some fixed amount that you could give this $1 million, you could think about saying, we can stretch that by giving 2-to-1 up to some amount, in this case it was $25 given, or for that same amount of match dollars, which would be $50 coming from this donor's, the lead donor's pool of match dollars, we could also give 1-to-1 on everything up to 50. So what we wanted to hold constant was the amount of dollars coming from the match itself. So that's why the 2-to-1 was on a lower dollar amount than the 1-to-1. So we wanted to say, can you lower the match but extend how many dollars you're going to match on? So we're holding constant that, thinking of if you have a limited amount of match dollars that are available, what is the best way to use that limited amount of match dollars?
Okay, that's super. I'm going to cut off questions here and say that if at the end you have more questions for Michael, we will certainly take those when we close. We will now turn to Robert Metcalfe. Robert?
Right, thank you all. So I'm going to talk briefly about how charities can use what we call behavioral economics to increase the power of the ask, essentially. So what we were interested in is thinking beyond just prices, as Mike has just gone through. You know, prices are actually really quite important when we're thinking about charitable giving. But there's a whole host of different reasons out there about why someone could be given to charity, and thinking about what are the mechanisms and the levers that charities can use to actually increase the likelihood of giving from a cold or warm donor list. So what I want to draw your attention to right now is the fact that we should be focused on people's behaviors and not their intentions. So here at SPI, we do a lot of work with charities, a lot of field experiments, and we also do work outside of charitable giving with private entities where the main method of research is focus groups. It's asking people what will change their behavior in the future. It's all about intentions. And there's more and more evidence now out there that suggests that intentions are not a good guide to future behavior change. And we should be focusing more on actual observing people's behavior and not about asking them about their behavior. So what we should rely on is actually understanding the context and not necessarily changing people's minds. And I'll give you a quick number so you can actually go back and tell your colleagues. But we find that about 3% of the variance of human behavior change is accounted for by people's intentions. The rest of it are just out there. It's all noise. It's all the context that people face at that point in time. So the approach to research has to incorporate some sort of observation of people's behavior. So this is what we're going to sort of talk about today, is real life experiments that have actually shown how important some of these levers that you can pull to actually increasing the likelihood of someone giving to your charity or to some other cause. And what I want to bring your attention to is attention. Now, the actual quote, "pay attention," requires you to have some sort of cost. You're paying for it. So what you can draw attention to in a mail out, in a phone campaign, is really quite important. So what I want to sort of pick apart is the last sort of 20, 30 years, we've seen a great amount of evidence on how things beyond just prices can be important to human behavior. And Mike has nicely gone through the impact of matching gifts, which we call prices, but you very rarely find that in a focus group or asking people that they will say, yeah, increase the match and I'm more likely to give. But as Mike has explained, there's far more nuances to that might not necessarily be true. So what I want to say is that actually sometimes people are not necessarily attentive to prices, and they are more concerned about other things. So you can't actually always change people's behavior by making it more likely that they can benefit from that behavior in a financial viewpoint. But secondly, our choices can be changed by the context in which you make that decision. So sometimes we see that people are often malleable and they don't have fixed choices over time. So what I want to sort of draw home is a checklist that you can use in your day-to-day job to actually increase the likelihood of your drive or your ask actually working. So it's a 9-letter acronym that hopefully it's easy to remember, and it's called MindSpace. And these are sort of the gathering up of all the sort of the behavioral interventions that you can use to increase the power of the ask. And I'll go through 3 examples. I'll go through defaults, I'll go through affect, and I'll go through commitment. But if you type into Google MindSpace, you'll be able to find a document that actually helps you to understand what these 9 elements are. But I'll briefly go through them now. The first is the messenger. It's having the correct person or the correct organization that's doing the ask. And that cannot be underestimated. As Mike said, incentives are important, but we are sometimes driven by mental shortcuts and heuristics that suggest that financial incentives are not always the best thing to use, and we need to be aware of the behavioral and psychological responses to financial incentives. The third thing is what Anya will talk about after I speak, is about sort of the social forces out there. The norms, both the descriptive and the injunctive norms. And by descriptive, I mean what everyone else is doing. If I see everyone else giving to charity, I might be more likely to give. But also the injunctive norm, which is what everyone thinks I ought to be doing. So it's not about behaviors, it's about what people think you ought to be doing. I'll talk at length about defaults, so we also go with the flow of preset options. Saliency is also quite important about what attention is drawn to. And attention is drawn to novelty. And we are more likely to pay attention to novelty than things that we already know. Then there's priming, which is we are sometimes influenced by unconscious cues like smells, sights, touch and taste. And that's a very sort of social psychology viewpoint. Then we have affect, which is people's emotions, and emotions can shape behavior. We also want to be consistent with our promises in the future by today's promises, and we are very reciprocal. So if someone does something for us, we'll do something back. And lastly, we want to feel better about ourselves, and we don't want to have our behaviors in being inconsistent with our attitudes. This is like an acronym that you can use to think about how your drive can be important to the actual amount of money that you get from the asking of the individuals for any type of drive. So I'll go through defaults first, and I'll pick up on affect and commitment as I go through. So what we find with defaults is that people go with the flow. Wherever the preset options are, people tend to not pay attention to it. So if people do want to pay attention to the preset option, that involves a cost of their attention. So what we find is that people just don't want to make a decision. And if you read the book Nudge, for example, by Cass Sunstein and Dick Thaler, they go at lengths to show that defaults matter to human behavior. There's no work in there on defaults and charitable giving, but we come on to that in a second. But people just go with what the current options are. And I'll give you an example in organ donation, which is what stimulated a lot of the behavioral economic research in the early 2000s, which is if you're a national government, you can decide whether you want an opt-in or an opt-out for an organ donation program. And if you're going to follow the SPI conference over the next day or two, there's a whole session on organ donation and thinking about this issue of opt-in and opt-out. But what we find is that you can construct it as in check the box if you want to donate your organs if you die of a car crash, or it could be check the box if you don't want to participate in an organ donation program if you have a car crash. And what we find is that people just generally do not tick the box. Okay? So whatever the presumed option is, people go with the flow. So we find that one of the most sort of strongest and striking effects in behavioral economics. Now, how can you use that for a drive, for asking people to donate to your charity? Well, when you go to a donation page, we find that you've got to fill out your details, about your name, your address, and your location, but also you're asked sometimes to give an amount. And we run an experiment with a large charity in the UK to actually understand the power of the default. So this, in the case, you have to actively opt in. So you have to pick between £5, £10, all the way up to £250 to donate. You've got to actively select what you want to give. What we did, we randomized this versus another option where £10 is automatically chosen. That's the presumed amount of money that you should give. And then we also had different values that were pre-selected. For example, we had the £40 option as well. And what we found is just by going from not having any options clicked to having £10, we significantly increased the likelihood of people giving to the charity. So we had a lot less people who dropped out of that web page. and we had significantly more individuals who actually gave. But what we found is that the actual value of that default mattered. So what we found is that when we had the £40 default selected, people were less likely to give than the £10. And that comes back to Mike's presentation, is that actually sometimes people are price sensitive. And when it comes to this default, people are price sensitive, even though the initial default made people more likely to give. So default can be a strong mechanism that you can use, but use it carefully. And that's why experimentation is important. Because having some positive number is good, but having it too high, and it can backfire to individuals, and you get less money. The second thing I want to focus on is affect, is people's emotions. And our emotional responses to words, images, events, are what Danny Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow describes as System 1 thinking, which we all share with all reptilian brains, where our amygdala just goes crazy at the sense of different stimuli. And what we have done in the charitable literature is try to understand how a mechanism underpinning affect can change people's desire to give. And moods can affect decisions. So Mike and John List and others did a campaign, a door-to-door campaign, on canvassing for money for a university project. And what they had different levels of female attractiveness of those knocking on the door, but they also had a lottery. So you could have a 1 in 5,000 chance to win $1,000 in a MasterCard. And what they found was that the attractiveness of the person who was asking for the money was much, much more important than actually the lottery itself in getting people to actually donate and giving higher donations. So what they found, so in statistical language, a 1 standard deviation change, which is a really large change in physical attractiveness, led to between a 50 and 133% increase in donation amounts. So just the context of that person coming to your door really can matter for who gives and the likelihood of giving. And we need to understand more about that messenger. That messenger who's going out on a door-to-door basis on the behalf of your organization. That person could be make or break for a lot of individuals on the margin by not giving. But again, only through doing an experiment where these things are randomized can we actually understand the effects of such mechanisms. And the last thing I'll talk about is commitments. And we all want to be consistent with our public commitments. Even private commitments we want to be consistent with. But commitments can be very, very powerful when we want to overcome our weakness. When we know in the future that we will be fragile and we will actually renege on our commitment. So we want to actually put in place strong mechanisms that can get people to be consistent with their behavior now and in the future. So one of the best things you could do is pre-committing people to give in the future. So I'll give you a great experiment that was done by Dick Thaler, obviously the author of Nudge, and Shlomo Benazzi, where they work with an organization to get people to pay more in pension contributions. And the thing that worked the best was getting people to actually say, I will put more in my pension pot next month. I will take some fraction of my bonus and put in my pension pot next month, but not this month. And what they find is that over this is like a 3-month period here, but over 2 years, they found that those in the treatment group who were given the option to put their future bonus into a pension pot had significantly higher savings rates in the future. Just by saying, don't put it into a pension pot now, put it into the future. And that's what we find with charitable giving. So Anna Berman did a great experiment where she worked with a charity to get people to donate, not donate now, but donate in the future. So she said, will you commit to an increase in your contributions starting next month? and the control group were just asked to give now. And what she found was if you were asked to give next month rather than today in a telephone response, you are 32% more likely to give. Okay? And what she finds is that over a 12-month period, that these results last. So when people are just delaying that cost of giving to the charity, it actually increases the giving, and that effect is sustainable over a 12-month period. And the cancellation rates that she found were identical across the two groups. So thinking about how your charity can delay the cost of giving could be a very important driver to getting people to donate more now in the next 12 months. Now, all us around the room right now have taken part in designing experiments with charities, designing experiments with firms and public policymakers. And we find that actually doing experiments with yourselves is actually a good way of trying to understand the benefit of what you do, of how you can actually change the behavior of your current and future donors, and also be a way in which you can go to your CEO, go to head of funders and say, we did this experiment and we found that this worked. Just by comparing two means through a randomized controlled trial, can you be confident that you have moved the needle in terms of actual donations given to your charity? So the advantages of experiments are numbersome, but the actual ability to show that you have changed behavior is something I think we should all strive for. But it can change an organizational culture. So once the first and the second experiment goes ahead and it's successful, then it starts to engender and motivate other parts of the organization to change their behavior too and do experiments. So it can create organizational culture change as well. So to sum up, the behavioral responses that we've found in terms of trying to change behavior both in the charity literature and in the non-charity literature have all come about through doing field experiments. Through working with SPI academics or working with other academics, can we find out how important these mechanisms are to changing human behavior? And they do have impressive results. Some of these things are really low cost. Asking people to give next month rather than this month is a low cost intervention that actually can increase revenue quite a lot. So we're in the game of trying to actually find out what works in changing charitable giving, but doing so at low cost. And lastly, I want to drive home that intentions, focus groups, consumer insight is not a good guide to how people will change their behavior in the future. And doing experimentation is the way forward, both in the charitable world and the non-charitable world. So thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Robert. That was excellent. So if anyone has questions, please email those questions to us, put them on the link here. I'm going to start out by following up on something that Melissa Brown asked of Michael Price. So Rob talked about various behavioral manipulations. So ideas from behavioral economics to push people to give. Do you have evidence on the long-run effects of these sorts of interventions? And what I mean by long-run effects, really on two dimensions. One, do people just give you money now instead of giving later? That's sort of what Melissa Brown was asking Michael about. And two, do people get used to these sorts of interventions to where they might work the first time, they might work a little bit less the second time, but then the third time they don't work at all, or they might even become perverse? Can you give us some insights on that?
Yeah, so there actually aren't a lot of experiments that have tried to understand what that donor journey looks like from using behavioral stimuli. I think that the best research that we have, it's not in the charitable literature, it's in the energy literature, where a company called O-Power, they use norms. They use social descriptive norms to tell you how well you are doing in comparison to your neighbors on energy consumption. So they say, if you consume more than your neighbors, you're an energy inefficient person, and they try to lead you to behaviors to try and reduce your energy consumption. Now what they found is that they give these home energy reports every month to the treatment group. So every year you receive about 12 of these home energy reports. And they get a consistent 2% reduction in energy consumption. But then when you take those home energy reports away, people's energy consumption goes back to normal. It doesn't go back to zero, but it goes back towards the mean. So what, in that area, you need to continually give some sort of stimuli to individuals to change their behavior. That's the best evidence that we have. I don't think we have any good evidence in the charitable literature on how repeated interventions using the same stimuli can backfire or crowd in future giving. And I think that's an area that I think SPI would be very interested in working with charities to understand that long-term consequences of asking people not only different times, but also different stimuli.
Okay, very good. So I will go to the next question from Banu. How does the pre-selected lower amount impact potential giving? Secondly, would you suggest a pledge choice on the website contribution page?
Yeah, so what we think is that on the experiment that we had randomized between no option selected, £10 selected, and £40 selected. And what we found in previous drives, that the average given was around about £9. So what we found was that the £10 seemed to be okay by people's standards. I give around that value, therefore £10 okay. When you go to £40, it's just so much for individuals that they might feel, we don't know this, but they might feel that's just too much of an ask. You're asking me for too much, and therefore I'm just going to come out of the system altogether. So I think trying to find out that optimal default for each individual is something that the behavioral science literature has very little evidence about right now. Cass Sunstein, the author of Nudge, has a book coming out called about optimal defaults that governments can choose, but I don't think we have a good evidence right now about what is that best numeraire that you can give to consumers to actually get the most money out of them in the future. When it comes to the pledge, I think trying to get those pledges to be public would be a good way of trying to get people to be consistent with their behavior from now and in the future. But what was great about the experiment that I highlighted by Anna Bremen was that money was going to be given in the future. So just delayed the cost. And trying to get those individuals to actually give in the future, if there's no sanctions, is actually quite difficult. So I think the pledge can work, but again, we don't have enough evidence in the charitable world of that actually working in a good randomized controlled trial sense.
Okay, the next question is from Cynthia Maloney, who asks, can you give an example of context-changing behavior?
So, by context, I mean all of the elements that I just described of that sort of mind space checklist, the messenger, the norms, the default. It's changing the context. So people might not necessarily be aware of the context from a conscious point of view, but they might be aware from an unconscious point of view. So when it comes to the default example that I just mentioned, by changing the pre-select option from £10 to £40, you've changed the context for the individual. So subtle changes to wording of a donation form or a solicitation ask can really have large consequences to what is the result in terms of those given and the amount that they give. So subtle changes, so everything, even from how you structure that page being sent out to individuals. The design of that page is actually quite important to the likelihood of people giving, and the conversation you have at the door, the conversation on the telephone, or that letter being sent out on a drive, all the language being used is quite important to whether people give or not. And that's what the context I mean.
Thank you. So Benu wants to clarify the question, and I think I will try to take this question on. He says, Robert, the question is, would the preset amount encourage a current donor to contribute less? So SPI has actually just published a paper. It's written by a graduate student of mine named James Edwards and myself. We co-authored this paper where we look at whether the ask amount, whether it should be $25, $50, $100, $150, $250, what does that ask amount do to, first, does a person give at all? And then second, conditional on giving, how much money do they actually give to our cause? And your intuition is exactly right. For those people who were planning on giving $200, if you give them an ask amount that is equal to, say, $100 or $150, that person typically does move the gift down to $100 or $150 rather than deciding to give $200 as they would have given without the particular ask. So then your intuition could be, well, maybe we should just always aim really high and ask for 250 or 300 or 500, but the problem with that strategy is that many people are nervous or afraid to give an amount that is less than the ask. So it ends up that there's an algorithm that you can use to determine, based on previous donation patterns, what your ask level should be. And if you go and look in that paper, again, it's a paper by James Edwards and myself, John List, you will find insights into how to optimally set that amount of the ask, whether it's $50, $100, or $200. Okay, Benu, so I hope that answers your question. Melissa, I'm having a hard time asking or answering that particular question. Looks like prior am. So what I'm going to do now is ask all of you to hold your questions for Robert now until the end, and we will move on to our third panelist. And this third panelist is also a person who has been a member of SPI since the very beginning. Her name is Anya Samek, and she is currently a visiting professor here at the University of Chicago, visiting from the University of Wisconsin. So, Anya, please go ahead.
Can I start? Can I start?
Sure.
All right, great. So my name is Anya Samek, as John said, and I'm here to talk about your neighbors and your generosity. So I have this guy up on the screen here. His name is Stuart, and he's peeking out from under a rock because what we want to think about is what is the influence of your neighbors on your charitable giving. So as we know, most of us don't live under a rock. Most of us are actually surrounded by many different people that we encounter every day. These are all of Stuart's neighbors here. Not only that, we also observe that all of these people are interconnected in different ways. So you've got your Facebook friends, you've got your neighbors, you've got your work colleagues, and Stuart here has to be thinking about all of these different people in his life and all of the different networks that he's part of when he makes decisions, and in particular when he makes decisions about cooperating or about charitable giving. Because what we know is that social preferences and our beliefs about others' influence on us particularly play a role in non-market settings. A market setting is something about when I go out and I buy something, I don't signal any kind of generosity about myself in that case. But if I go out and I decide to donate to charity, or I go out and I volunteer, now people think about something about me as a person. So if I'm giving to a charity, people look at me and think, oh, I'm generous. If I'm not giving to a charity, people look at me and say, why aren't I generous? And so Stuart has to be cognizant of all of these different people in his life, what they think about him, and what he thinks about them. Now actually your neighbors matter from an evolutionary perspective. We see that even capuchin monkeys and young children exhibit behaviors in line with cooperating and donating to charity. So as humans, we're social creatures, and we have to keep in mind that context matters, and the kinds of social ties that we make and form also really matters. Now, behavioral economics, you might think, why are economists in this world of charitable giving? I heard economists actually just try to make money on the stock market. So that's often what I hear when I tell people I'm an economist. But indeed, I'm a behavioral economist. And the main premise of behavioral economics is simply that behavior isn't random, and we can actually predict behavior with two very important components. First, we have constraints. So we believe individuals are constrained by what they can do. We don't have unlimited money, and we don't have unlimited time. And the second is objectives, what the individual actually wants to do. And that means maximizing utility. We use the word utility a lot, we just mean satisfaction. Utility can be money, but it can be social capital, it can be how people feel about me, my social status, it can be the warm glow I get from giving. And I try to maximize satisfaction subject to constraints. What your neighbors are doing is a big part of that decision. All right, so what are behavioral economists then? Behavioral economists want to learn about the underpinnings of human behavior through using this model that incorporates objectives and constraints. We want to be able to predict how individuals will behave in different environments, and we want to provide insights into which environments to apply to obtain desired results. In this case, we're thinking about increasing charitable giving in the philanthropic sector. So let's see, here I have Stuart. He's hooked up to an EEG machine. Indeed, we don't hook people up to EEG machines, but we do things in laboratories to try to understand human behavior. And as Robert mentioned, we're interested particularly in behavior rather than in intentions. So what are Stuart's underpinnings? We have two main things that Stuart might be thinking about. The first one is, what do neighbors think of me? Stuart cares about his social status in the community, among his neighbors, among his Facebook friends, among his co-workers. And the main thing here is that Stuart wants to seek prestige. So he wants people to like him, he wants people to believe that he's a nice guy. He wants to avoid shame, so he doesn't want to be the only guy in his office that didn't donate to the United Way. The second thing that Stuart is thinking a lot about is, what are my neighbors doing? So as we are interacting in our environments, we're picking up cues about what is the social norm. So what is the right thing to do, and how can I do that thing in order to make sure that I am perceived as a good person or an okay person? So that includes what we call self-signaling, and what psychologists often talk about self-signaling. It's this idea that I have a belief about who I am, and I want to take actions that are in line with that belief. We also could think about other signaling. So in the case that my decision is made in public, I want to be sure that I'm making the right decision. Finally, the other kind of information that Stuart can get when he sees his friends giving to a charity, in particular, is the quality of the charity. So we don't have much attention, as Robert mentioned. We need to, it costs some effort and some time. We know we're constrained by time to actually learn about the quality of different charities. But if I learn that Robert has given money to a particular charity, I know little about that charity, but I trust Robert has made a good decision, and I might also then give. So to sum up, we know that generosity in giving is an evolutionary trait. It's partly innate and partly socialized. Myself and John Liss have actually done some work with young children trying to understand how generosity develops over time, how parents and how schools actually influence the way that you develop and the types of social preferences that you have, and how those predict future giving. We also know, though, that people take cues from their environment, especially in situations where they're unsure of what the right thing to do is. We might try to see what others are doing to give ourselves further insights into the social norm. So our objective is to maximize satisfaction, and when we deviate from social norms, especially when we deviate in ways that make us look not like such a great person, that makes Stuart look like he's not such a great guy, then we have a lowered satisfaction. So we get satisfaction from having a higher social status. In private, that means comparing myself to some norm that also matters to me, but in public, it's often even a stronger effect because of my reputation and my social status. So we could make some predictions from this simple setup that we have here. First, if we take cues from the environment that perceives that the social norm is to increase giving, that's going to increase generosity. So if I look around and everybody is giving a lot, I want to also give a lot. If we see cues that stinginess is okay, so if I see many people who are free riding or taking advantage of the fact that others give and we don't have to give, that might decrease giving. So if I see that there's a fundraiser but none of my friends have chosen to give, I might be less likely to give. And finally, third, when information about my own gift is made public, I'm going to be more likely to give. So today I'll go through 3 different studies in which we actually can try to see whether some of these predictions hold true. The first study is by some of our SPI friends, Jen Sheng and Rachel Crossan. They've been working for a number of years with a public radio station campaign. In this campaign, it's a phone-a-thon. People call in and they make a decision about how much to give. And so in a series of several studies, Jen and Rachel were actually trying to think about what will be the effect if we tell the caller about the previous gift of another caller. And one thing that they didn't want to do is they didn't want to deceive people. So they actually found some amounts of gifts that previous callers had given, and they used those amounts in a randomized field experiment. It was a randomized field experiment because essentially they flip a coin every time someone calls, and they either tell them a previous person has given $75, a previous person has given $180, previous person has given $300, and so on, and then they look at what that person has given. Because we're randomizing people to treatment in this way, we can actually isolate the causal impact of a suggested gift amount from someone else on the behavior. And so the first thing they find, and here they run 3 different experiments. So they have one with just a couple of different amounts. They have another where they actually suggest quite high amounts. So suppose I call into the radio station and I get told, oh, the previous donor has given $1,000. That's quite high. And they also look at downward versus upward information. So they actually know, if I call in, what was my gift last year? And they either offer me social information that someone gave more than me or that someone gave less than me. So we have some very simple takeaways. The first one is that downward social information is actually more powerful than upward. Indeed, when I give you downward social information, you decrease your gift amount by a lot more than if you increase it if I give you social information on the upward side. Secondly, when we give people social information that is drawn from the 90th to 95th percentile of distributions of gifts in the previous year, that was going to be the most effective at increasing giving. And indeed, if you give amounts that are too high, like the $1,000, which is outside of that 95th percentile of gifts, this actually decreases contributions. So here what we find is that some predictions hold true. Indeed, we observe that when we provide social information to people about higher gift amounts, that causes giving to increase. We also find the same result in the opposite direction, so giving suggested amounts that are too low causes giving to decrease. And we also find that kind of wild gift amounts, like $1,000, have a negative effect. And that's going back to what Robert also found, which is that when we put the default at 40 pounds, it just seems too high to people, they don't give at all. So let's look at one more study. So this is a study that I ran with David Riley. And here we are looking at also suggested amounts, but this time it is the charity who is providing the suggested amount. Interestingly enough, here we also work with a radio and TV station. And so informal observations of your mail would suggest that there's not just one amount there that you can give. You can see multiple check boxes, and you can choose one of these things. So you could choose to give 25, 35, 50, or you can write in an amount. So writing in an amount is always an option. And our motivating question here was, suppose we nudge the set of suggested amounts just a little bit. So we go from 30 being the lowest to 35 being the lowest. what will be the result? We work with public broadcasting stations in Arizona, and we sent a mailing campaign to 36,000 potential previous donors. So unlike the study by Jen and Rachel I just talked about, in our study, we send a mailing out and we look at response rates. Before, they were actually receiving phone calls and then just giving information. And we have actually 4 different treatments. So again, we print up a bunch of letters and we randomly choose which letter we send to which donor. And so here we have these 2 fixed sets of fixed amounts, and we also have some variable amounts in which we condition the set of suggested amounts based on last year's donation. And what do we find? We find that asking for more money leads to fewer gifts. So we start out about a little under 12% of people actually respond with a gift in the fixed 1 condition, where the lowest suggested amount is 30. Once we go to fixed 2, we raise the lowest suggested amount just a little bit. We decrease giving to about 9%. And we can see this decreasing trend here for the TV members, and we also see a quite similar result for the radio members. So what are the takeaways here? So not only do we care about what our neighbors are doing, we actually care about what the charity is telling us to do. We want to think about what is the social norm. As John just mentioned, we feel wrong giving an amount that's lower than a suggested amount. We actually perceive that as being a non-generous action. And so what we find is that having my past gift kind of in the middle of the suggested range is most ideal for gifts. Actually, here I also cite John's paper with James Edwards on just suggesting an amount of $20. So you can check that paper. We need a lot more work really to try to understand how suggestions from a charity may affect behavior and through what channels that actually works. Now we've talked a little bit about what your neighbors are doing and how that affects behavior. Now in my 3rd and final study, I'm going to tell you about how me knowing that my neighbors will find out what I'm doing affects behavior. And here we'll turn to the lab. So as experimental economists, we use the lab as a way to control our environment, carefully isolate different parts of the context, and think about the result on behavior. This is similar to a focus group in that we bring people to a lab setting, but it's quite different in that whereas in focus groups we might consider learning about intentions, in the lab we're always in an environment that's incentivized. We try to make their money be actually at stake, so we actually give people real money and we ask them how much they want to donate, and we study behavior. We try to understand the causal impact of the institution on behavior. So here's one laboratory experiment which I really like. It's called the public goods game. The idea for the public goods game is that we set people into an environment where there is a kind of a choice between donating everything of your money to the public good or donating or keeping it for yourself in a private account. We have 5 people in this setup. They actually come in, they sit at computer stations, and they're anonymous to one another. We have about 20 people in the room, so we have groups of 5 there. We have what's called the public good and the private account. And you get some amount of tokens. You get 80 tokens, and you're told you can choose to give some to the public good, and you can choose to keep some in your private account. Any money that's donated into the public good gets multiplied by 0.4 and given to everybody else. Any money in the private account is yours to keep. So what happens here is that this guy at the bottom, he might be thinking, hey, no one will know if I just keep all that money for myself. I still get the benefit of the public good, but I don't have to donate. That's called free riding. That's actually what we call the Nash equilibrium thing to do, which is that it maximizes self-interest. I can still benefit from what others are doing. I don't have to participate. Indeed, in this public goods game, what we call the socially optimal equilibrium to do is for everybody to donate everything. Because when everybody donates everything, we have a bigger pie. So we run this laboratory experiment at Purdue University, And we have university students coming in, about several hundred students in this experiment, and we randomize them to a few different treatments. And they play the game 20 times with the same other group members. And here's the experiment. So we have one set of people who are completely anonymous to one another. And then we have a bunch of series where we actually introduce the ability to have a reputation. And we take photos of everybody in the group and we put their photo next to their contribution amount to the public good. So now, instead of an anonymous person number one who gave nothing, we have Robert who gave nothing, or Robert who gave everything, one of those two. And then we say we recognize everyone. So we have the none treatment, we compare to the all treatment. Then we have two more treatments where we try to isolate what it is about being recognized that matters. There's two theories. The first is that being recognized as a top donor increases prestige. So I increase my social status, it makes me feel good. And we try to isolate that by saying, in that treatment, only the top 2 donors will have their photos displayed next to the amount that they gave to the public good. Then we have one flip side of that, which is shame. The idea is I don't want to be recognized as the one who gave the least. So I'm going to try to shame you into giving more by saying I will only publicize the lowest 2 givers, and that includes people who choose not to give at all. So let's look at our results. So this is now the contribution as a percentage of the total endowment. It was 80 tokens in this game, which are converted to dollars later, across 20 periods. The dotted line is the none treatment, which is where everyone is anonymous to one another. And the red line is the all treatment, in which case I show the photos of everyone in your group. What we see is a significant increase in giving when people know that they're not anonymous. We see a big jump from at the very beginning, from about 50% of the contributions to almost 70% of the contributions. So we see that recognition matters. People care what their neighbors think of them. Next, we want to introduce the treatment where we recognize just the top people. Now, Roman and I thought everyone wants to be the top guy. We all want to be recognized. What will be the outcome here? We observe indeed that recognition of being a top donor in this setting didn't matter very much. It increased contributions by a little bit, but not as much as recognizing everyone. So we thought, well, what is causing this recognition of everyone to push giving so high? I thought it must be the recognition of the bottom donors. So people don't like to be the ones that are giving the least. And indeed, that's exactly what we find. So in the treatment where we recognize the bottom guys, we see a significant increase in donations. So now we have some takeaways from this. Recognition by peers is very effective for increasing giving, and shame is very relevant for this environment. Prestige here is less relevant. But this environment is pretty special. So it's one where you can't actually exit or enter. You are stuck here. It could actually be an environment that you might think about existing in the real world. You could think about alumni of a high school or of a university who know one another and who can't really exit that group. What we started the talk with is this idea that everybody is part of a network. This isn't going to work for a charity group where I can just say, hey, this charity keeps writing my name on the board as being a low giver, I should just not participate. But it can definitely work for somewhere like my high school, which was a small high school where every couple of months we get a newsletter saying, here are all the givers, and here are all the alumni that we haven't heard from in a while. That kind of makes me want to give. So here we have the end of the slides.
Anya, thank you very much. That was a tour de force. We went all the way from peers to buckets or ask amounts, and then we had a bit of some lab experimentation at the end. So I think what that does is it showcases exactly how you can use multiple tools to answer questions within the economics of charity. So I'm now going to open it up to questions, and we have our first question from Sharon Tickness. She asks you, Anya, do you think this trend would hold at an event where people are invited to give to fund organizational needs?
Which trend? The
I think the trend of the public good.
Okay.
Yeah, the last few slides.
So the question is,
Do you think this trend would hold at an event? And I think what we're talking about is an event like a fundraiser gala, or an organization has a party of some sort, and they invite people in and they ask the potential donors to fund organizational needs.
so I think it really is the case that shame from not being a donor has a big impact on becoming a donor. We see that not only in the charitable sector or in these lab experiments that we run, we also see that with something like voting. So in some experiments, political scientists have actually told people they'll publicize lists of non-voters and have increased dramatically voter participation, more than almost any other possible intervention that they could have run. In the case of a gala, if everybody is in the room together and you come up with clever ways to recognize donors while at the same time making non-donors visible, I think that's truly the trick. So rather than recognizing a non-donor explicitly like we do in a lab, which would be silly for a charity to actually do, you could have name tags in which donors actually have an additional kind of star next to them. And when donors talk to non-donors at this event, it's quite clear that the non-donors haven't given. We actually did another follow-up lab study in which we recognized people but made it costly to view the information. So we reduced the visibility of the recognition, and we find exactly the same result as if the visibility was quite clear. So it doesn't have to be that visible. Just as the fact that people know that they may be found out as a non-donor can increase contributions, and that's probably the right direction to go.
Okay, thank you. Melissa Brown has a question for you. Have any studies looked at giving amounts with a note, every gift helps?
So that's quite a good question. There is one study that's older that was conducted in which the message was even a penny helps. And that actually significantly increased the likelihood of giving as compared to simply asking for a gift, or as compared to asking for a higher gift amount. I think the idea of pairing suggested gift amounts with every gift helps could be quite an interesting way forward, but I haven't seen anything on that.
Okay, now Sharon hints at, Michael, maybe you want to come in now. I'm going to ask a few general questions, and Sharon is hinting at one of those questions. In many cases, you have charities using auctions or lotteries to raise money. And what I mean by that, you might have supporters donate trips to Hawaii or cars or jewelry or some such, and you have a charitable event whereby people actually bid on that good in an auction, typically an English auction where people are raising their paddle, having fun, and there's a lot of joy in the room. That's one sort of fundraising approach. Another one is to use those prizes in an actual lottery where you sell tickets to the lottery. And what I mean by that, say every $5 that you give to the charity, you get one chance to win a lottery prize. I think the question is, are these tools useful for raising more money and inducing people to contribute to your cause? Michael, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, this actually goes back to one of the studies that Rob talked about during his presentation where he focused on the attractiveness of the solicitor, but this was some work that John and I have worked on together, along with some colleagues at East Carolina University and Andrea Slang, where we actually looked at this question: if you link donations to the chance of winning a raffle prize, what happens to the amount of dollars that are coming in. And we found that it had incredible impacts. We attracted something, it increased the likelihood of giving by approximately 50%. And similar impacts on average contributions coming in. Not only that, I think this gets back to some of the questions that have been posed with sort of the longer run impacts. That same study, we go back, we find that, the attractiveness or characteristics of the person who was asking you for the donations and providing this lottery incentive had similar impacts in that initial campaign. But now if you look at the longer run impacts, so we go back to the same group for a repeat solicitation approximately a year later, we actually find that those who were offered the chance of the lottery were more loyal than any other donor type that we have brought in. So those that were brought in because of the attractiveness of the solicitor or characteristics of the solicitor, those who just volunteered to give, who had approached just a simple ask, those that saw the lottery, were offered the lottery, were more loyal. And I think this links back to the point about matching, that this is our interpretation, our thoughts on this is that not only do you increase the benefit to the person or the opportunities to the person from giving, I can get this chance at not only supporting the cause, I could win this raffle, it also serves to send a signal of the quality of the charity. It makes it memorable. It's saying somebody has provided these prizes. This is a cause we should get behind. And that enhances the long run success of these types of programs.
Okay, so thank you. And Cynthia wants to follow up with a very practical and important question. So Michael, if I have a prize or a set of prizes, should I use a lottery or should I use a silent auction?
That is a very good question, and one where I think the evidence is sort of silent on it. That there's not a good amount of evidence out there on comparing lotteries versus auctions. I would say, knowing what we know from the behavioral literature, a silent auction is probably amongst the alternatives. If you think that part of this to link with what Anya was saying is it's these social pressures around us being observed. We want to, we want to show off to it, or we want others to know that we care. A silent auction may sort of ramp down some of those added incentives. But I think thinking about this bigger question of if I have these opportunities, should I set them as lottery prizes or raffle prizes or use them as auctions is an area that's an important question and is largely unanswered, and something hopefully at SPI and others we can inspire to work on these questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's no direct evidence, but at least the data that scientists have delivered would suggest that if you had to do it tomorrow night, I would do it via a lottery rather than a silent auction. I think that would probably be fair. Okay, do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
No, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's very common organizations rank donors, so a $1,000 donor might be better than a $500, but donors also rank organizations. This is my favorite nonprofit. This is my less favorite nonprofit, even though I may support them. And I was curious if there's been any research into trying to understand more donor-specific information about where the organization ranks when you're actually playing with these ask strings, maybe being more aggressive where somebody would actually care about being the largest dollar donor to their ability, as opposed to somebody who would never want to be the largest donor because I don't care about you as much as I presume other donors do.
You guys go ahead.
That's an excellent question, and I think one of the reasons that we do observe people giving is because they feel guilty about not giving. So this whole avoidance of shame idea, or avoidance of having self-signaling myself as a person that's not generous. Mm-hmm. And when we say the suggested amount is $40, the idea then is, do I signal that I'm generous and give $40, or do I just feel guilty and give nothing? When we allow people to give these smaller amounts, and we say even a penny helps, that legitimizes a smaller gift. It allows me to give a gift at a cost of just $1 rather than $40 to avoid feeling guilty from not giving. Mm-hmm. So if we think about people intentions to actually give. We might observe many people that are giving to causes they don't care very much about because of social pressure, because they're asked, as Robert was pointing out. We ask people, we nudge them, and then they give. When we observe some of these larger gifts, those might be the altruistic people who actually seek out the charity and want to give because they care about that charity specifically. And so if we can figure out who those people are, I think suggesting higher amounts to them would be perfectly the right thing to do. So I think that's kind of the dilemma right now, is that when we shift these suggested donations upward, what we're losing is those donors who would normally give a small amount. And maybe that's okay, because maybe what we need to do in the long term is try to select into our warm list those donors who care about the charity, that we can shift upward more and suggest higher amounts.
Thanks.
Okay, so Cynthia Maloney has a follow-up question about the raffle ticket idea versus the silent auction. Cynthia says a raffle ticket can cost less, but a silent auction bid costs more. Silent auction is not anonymous. Bidders can see other bidders' offers. Now, let's just go after this question one by one. You're exactly right. In a silent auction, when I write down my name and my bid, every other bidder that follows me can see my name and my bid. So on the dimension of showing off or showing people how kind you are, I think the silent auction does well. The oral auction obviously does well too. And the lottery is not as good on that dimension. I think what you have to remember though, in an auction, only one person pays money, and that's the winner. So the winner of the silent auction has the high bidder paying the amount of her bid, and then the charity receives that amount. Now in a lottery, everybody pays in. You have not only the person who wins the lottery, but also all those people who purchase lottery tickets. Of course, those proceeds also go to the organization. So on some dimensions, auctions might be better. On other dimensions, lotteries might be better. And in the end of the day, we need to run experiments to try to figure out which one is better. Now, after you ask that question, you can say, well, wait a second, John. If a lot of lottery participants do not win prizes, does that cause them to be sad and then not give in the long run? And I think that's a very important consideration that all of us must address moving forward when we're using that sort of mechanism. So I'm going to open a very broad question to each of the panelists, and I want them to put themselves in the shoes of a consultant. And you have a charity which approaches you, and this is an entirely novel question, so this is not a setup. You have a charity that approaches you and asks, I want to run a big capital campaign, $20 million campaign maybe for a new building or a new program. Give me advice from the very beginning to the end about what I should be doing. And this should include your approach to upfront money. For example, what fraction of upfront money should I secure in private before going public with my fundraising drive? After I receive those upfront monies, what should I do with them to secure participation from a broad donor base? Should I use it as seed money? Should I use it as matching dollars, etc.? And then what are the tricks of the trade that you would use to get people committed to your cause, to not only give for the first time, but to keep them committed for the long run? So that's obviously a 20-part question, but it's a question that I am oftentimes approached with in the field. I've been doing charitable fundraising work now for close to 20 years. I started doing research in the mid to late 90s on the economics of charity, and a common question that I receive is one along those lines. So I want to ask the top minds in the world working on the economics of charity to give me advice, give my charity some advice. Who wants to go first?
So
Michael Price.
So I'll take those questions in order and how they came in. I would have to say on the first one, sort of what fraction of the cost should I get before going public with it? I would say that we still don't have a good sense on what that is, and that's an important question that we need to answer. And I think when you talk with different people, there's different rules of thumb and different words that come out, but there's not a definitive answer. And I don't think that it's necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all, here's the amount that you should always go. I think it's going to depend a lot on your donor base and who it is that you're trying to approach subsequently. So I would say this is an area that we need a lot more work in. Not to pun on it, but I think that's really just the state of the art or where we are.
We're going to call that punt number one. Okay. So when you look at lottery or fundraising manuals, Michael's right. They're all over the map. You have some practitioners telling you should raise 33 to 40% of the goal in private before going public. You have some practitioners telling you should raise 50%. Some saying that you should raise 60 to 70%. And all of that evidence that I can glean from these fundraising manuals and guidebooks, these are primarily anecdotes. And at SPI, we do have some research that looks at the level of seed money, and it looks like it goes up to 60 or 70% is still better than 50 or 30%. What I mean by that is more people give and they give more if you can announce up to 60 or 2/3 of your goal. But I think Michael's right. In general, we only have a few papers. Okay? So Michael, now after you receive the upfront money, what would you do with it?
And again, I think the answer on this depends on what your goals are. I think if your goals are saying, I want to build the largest donor base possible, I think the thing that we've had the most success with is the idea of a lottery, particularly with smaller donors. If you're trying to reach out to act on an acquisition format with smaller donors, the participation rates that we had in offering a lottery and across the board, not just in our own work, but in other studies, that's the most powerful mechanism. That's the best way. I think following up on your earlier question, or your answer on lotteries versus raffle or auctions, part of this as well is there's kind of this novelty with the lottery that everybody has the chance. So even the person who wants a low level of support for the charity isn't sure what it is. So again, the small donor who's going to give $10 still sees a chance at getting that prize and has that private incentive to want to give. Where with an auction, if I'm going to bid $10, I have zero chance of getting this. So another drawback on sort of the auction is that it's dampening some of those incentives. So I would say going after smaller donors, and if it's getting as many people coming in, a lottery would be, or some sort of raffle would be a very, very effective tool. There's less evidence, and almost actually no evidence on the effectiveness of that if you're going after larger donors. And so if the question is, how would I leverage upfront money going after larger donors? There, I think at least with some of what we've seen, if you're thinking of this as more of an investment, things that are really going to leveraging it as matching gifts, so their impact is going. They may, if they're more sensitive to prices, or things giving it recognition to them, appealing to those motives. So leveraging it to saying, okay, we'll create recognition for you, so others can see that this is the support. Would be strategies that I would use.
Okay, so upfront money. Robert or Anya, do you have any thoughts on uses of upfront money?
Yeah, I think what you were saying about the 60-70%, that's kind of like the norm has given. Mm-hmm. I think you're signaling to individuals that a lot of people have given already. And so other people want to be part of that norm, and therefore they want to give. So I think I can see why having larger numbers more towards 100% or up towards a large number can work better than, say, 20 or 30% just from that norm effect. So I would say I wouldn't probably go public with, say, we've got 10%, because it's just saying that not a lot of people have given to the cause. So I think from like a norm perspective, I would wait until it gets to like 50, 60, 70%.
Anya?
I would raise enough to cover the overhead, and then I would use the seed money to say to donors something like 100% of the overhead for this campaign has already been provided, and all we need from you is the money to actually build the building or to actually hire the teachers in the schools. And we actually have a talk at the SPI conference this weekend by one of our affiliates in which he shows that using seed money as overhead payment is a very effective way at increasing donations.
Okay, so now I want to hear your best idea for motivating people to give. You all three of you have talked about your different tricks or tools of the trade. So what I want to hear is your best idea for our audience of how to induce people to give maybe for the very first time, and also to give them incentives so they continue to support your cause for many, many years. Because ultimately, we're about the lifetime value of a donor. So that's essentially what we're trying to optimize or maximize. Who would like to take a first shot at that one?
I can go.
Anya, go ahead.
So I think in the long run, it can't be about using tricks to keep people engaged. I think the real solution is to try to find the donors that will remain committed. So rather than turning donors who are generally not committed into those who commit, we need to find the donors that commit. And so one way that charities have gone about that is through segmentation. So we think about people with families, people with dogs, people with motorcycles. We try to put them into groups. We try to do some kind of analytics to understand what types of groups are more likely to give, and that's great. But I think one thing we can do is go beyond that and use not just demographic information about people, but actual behavior to predict types. And so one of my very favorite papers is one by John and co-authors in which they actually allow donors to opt in or out of being asked. And in that way, they can actually use the information about whether you opted in or not to segment donors by behavior. And so if I allow you to opt in and I continue providing you with opportunities to opt in, more and more I'm able to select for better donors. I think one thing that charities are often ignoring is the cost side of fundraising. So we develop a big warm list and then we keep mailing them. And often I talk to charities and I ask, how much is this costing you? And it's costing often more to keep sending out these mailers than it is what we're getting back, because we haven't segmented these donors properly. If we understood that the only reason this guy Stuart gave 3 years ago is because his coworker also gave, or his mother guilted him into it, we would never continue sending the letters. So and we know people are heterogeneous. So we know some people indeed like to give all the time. Some people don't like to give at all, and others are conditionally cooperative, meaning that they respond to social pressures and then choose to give depending on context. If we can select on the right people, I think that's actually the answer going forward. But the question is how to develop mechanisms to do that. That's still open.
Okay, Robert?
So I would say you could use tricks initially to get different types of donors into the drive. But then once you do that, I think you've got to be a bit more clever with how you use that information. So once they've actually chosen to be a supporter of your charity, you could then use that then going forward to somehow make them feel like they are part of the project. And not a research paper, but the Ice Bucket Challenge by the ALS. I did it myself. I succumbed to the social pressure on Facebook by doing it. And before that, I had no idea about ALS, the society, the costs of that condition. And now by taking part in that challenge and donating to charity, I now feel obliged to check how that money is doing in the future and how it's being spent. Even though I only donated or was it $20 that you had to give, I feel compelled now to be part of that charity and be part of that drive. So getting that initial dollars in on the Ice Bucket Challenge was such a good social media strategy. That initial video of the guy with ALS doing the Ice Bucket Challenge, it's so powerful, and it really hammers home on your heartstrings. And I think trying to find those one-off drives is really quite difficult. But the main message is once you get more people in, whether it be through luck or some trick, you should then make them feel compelled that they are part of the project going forward.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think to follow up on what Anya was saying, I think we tend to underappreciate the importance of things like what she was talking about with your work with this idea of the once and done, or campaigns that you look at on the first time, that you actually allow donors to select out or to choose to do actions that reveal things about them and their motives, that now you can, in the long run, you go back to somebody who checked a box and said, I don't want to be solicited by this charity in the future. Sure, you can continue to send letters to him and maybe you'll get a contribution from him, but you should be thinking about it. What is the cost of trying to acquire that? And is there a better use of my dollars trying to find people who are going to remain committed? So I think there's lots of ways that you can go about that and trying to screen what the motives are, and then target your asks moving forward to the motives for giving. One that has been very powerful was your idea of allowing donors to opt out. So giving them the opportunity, check this box and we'll never contact you again. And that proved incredibly successful, not only in that first campaign, but when you're going back amongst those who remained active, were more loyal on average than those who weren't provided that option. We have a similar thing with our looking at unconditional thank you gifts. So here, whether you give a contribution or not, here's a token of thanks on our behalf, versus offering that same token, sort of the NPR model where it's requiring some minimum gift. Those that required a minimum donation to obtain the gift from, if we go back, were much more loyal in follow-up campaigns than were those who gave the same amount if they were provided that gift unconditionally. And so again, what we've learned something, our interpretation is that we've learned something about the motives for giving, and that they are, Anya, getting at your idea, these are the altruists. These are the people who are committed to the cause. You're learning something about them rather than other types. I think in general as well, the insight that has come across a lot of our work and other work that has been affiliated with SPI is that sort of behavioral economics, these tricks, if you want to call them tricks, are great in the short run on engaging people initially, but things like lotteries, raffles, auctions, conditional gifts, things that are changing, seed money announcements, that are changing the economic motives for giving, have a much more persistent effect. So the behavioral tricks work precisely the way that Kahneman and the behavioralists will talk about it during that hot phase of decision making with it. But if you remove that stimulus and they're thinking over the longer run, those impacts tend to wane. So if you're going to invest in it, thinking of, what is something that I can, learn something about their motives for giving, and then go back to those who care most about the cause. And two things that are going to send a signal of quality of it. I think that's been a common theme through what works, is you can interpret these as sending a signal of quality, and that are changing the economic reasons for giving on it rather than psychological reasons for giving. And coming up with strategies that address all three of those will prove very effective in the long run.
Okay, thank you. At SPI, we have two major goals. One of those goals is to bring more science into philanthropy. When we say science, we mean experimental methods, in particular field experiments. We also mean behavioral economics, bringing psychology, sociology, and other sister disciplines into economics to learn about what exactly is motivating people to give to a charitable cause. Now, the second major goal is to develop partnerships. And those partnerships are at the very core of what we're doing, partnerships between academics and practitioners. So panelists, when you think about partnerships, what is the perfect partner for you to pair together in an effort to help their charity raise more money and to help you learn about the economic science of philanthropy? Can you give a quick, a few minutes summary on what you're looking for when you're forming these scientific partnerships? Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the major attitudes that I like of individuals that I partner with is the fact that they may not necessarily know what works. An openness to experimentation, an openness to the fact that they may not necessarily have the right answer right now, and they're prepared to fail in the first instance to see what works, but then find out in the long term. That openness to learn new things, I think, is one of the most important things that I've experienced both in the charity world and in the private world, is wanting to know the right answer and to have patience to find out that right answer.
Anya or Michael?
I like Rob's answer. I think being open to learning and working together and applying new tools to the solicitation campaigns can be one of the greatest strengths for a practitioner who wants to partner with academics.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, I wouldn't add much to what Rob's answer was. I mean, I think the leading indicator and the leading thing you're looking for is this willingness to say, I want to try new things. I want to understand what makes my donors tick. I want to understand what is the most effective way to reach out to my donors and to try things to uncover that, and to have the ability and the willingness to go into that process on it. And so it's really that, coming with that attitude of saying, I would like to know what makes my donors tick to make my organization more successful. And that's where we can come in and we can work both on the academic side to learn insights that are important for us on the publication and the academic side, but also learn things that will be of practical relevance for the partners themselves. And so it's that openness, and that's starting from that question.
I'd like to add to that and say, experiments are fun. We do this work, actually we enjoy doing experiments, and not knowing necessarily what's going to work until the data comes in, it's actually quite enjoyable. And many people do actually get some learnings from actually figuring out not only what works, but actually how to do an experiment. And that improves their own sort of human capital about figuring out, establishing cause and effect. And I think people start to really love doing experiments then.
Okay, so I'm getting a sense of what a good partner looks like. Now let's say you and the partner begin to explore possibilities. And are there specific variables such as how many donors we've had previously to our organization, or any specific constraints that you as researchers are always looking out for? Because in many cases there are charities out there, some of them have a warm list of only 500 people. Some of them have a warm list of 500,000 people. And are these specific variables important when you form partnerships in a way that our potential partners should know about?
So I would say that the two constraints beyond the sample size issue that you mentioned, John, is the ability to randomize the thing that you care about or the thing that we care about. So when it comes to a mail campaign with 50,000 donors, do you have the capabilities in-house to send one version of a letter to say 15,000, another variation letter to another 15,000, and then 20,000 receiving the default of the business as usual? Having that ability is quite important for us in terms of randomization is the most important thing that we can get at to establish cause and effect. And the second thing is keeping good data sets on who has given and what amount they have given, and how they've engaged with the charity. Those two things, the ability to randomize and the measurement of who engages with the charity and by how much engagement, I think are the two most important.
Let me push a little bit more specifically, and I'm going to follow up because Melissa is urging me. She wants to know if you need a donor database of a certain size. Are there some charities that are just too small for you researchers? What do you think?
I think it depends also on the way in which you want to solicit. So when we do mailing solicitations, often we see these sample sizes of 30,000 donors that we mail to. Not all of them are warm list donors, so we can actually purchase address lists, and charities do this all the time.
And so what is the minimum number of people who you are looking to mail to have a viable scientific study?
So what I see in many mailouts, not on the charitable literature, but elsewhere when it comes to those individuals that can benefit, you get sometimes like a 10% response rate. So if you had a good intervention that went from a 10% response rate to say 13%, you would need about 1,600 individual addresses to contact in the treatment group and the control group. So about maybe 3,500 to get a 3 percentage point change on a 10% ladder. So there's many different types of effect sizes that are going to impact on that sample size, but I think having a decent sample size is important to us.
Right. I think the bottom line is we're willing to work with any size firm, but Robert's right that the larger the sample size, the more specific your hypotheses can be to detect subtle behavioral differences. But we have treatments that lead to very large behavioral differences, and in that world, you can do experiments with as few as 100 or 200 donors. But you really have to have behavioral interventions that will lead to very, very large effects. I think that's kind of the way to think about it. Melissa, that's why I wrote, they won't answer my question for all of you who are following along. It's a hard question, and it's one that we receive often from potential partners who think, I'm really small and there's no way that I have anything that I can give to these researchers who are constantly talking about running experiments. So when I was doing the experiments with Smile Train and now WonderWorks, where we have millions of letters that we send out in treatment and control. And when you have that sort of sample size, you can look at much more detailed types of interventions to look for very subtle changes in behavior. That's a trade-off that, Melissa, I want you to be thinking about when it comes time to ask researchers or talk about sample sizes. So now that we're at that point, one thing that, and this will be the very last question that I ask the panelists, once you have data from an experiment, what I observe as an academic, not only when I work with nonprofits, but also for-profits and also government agencies, that once you have data, people aren't really sure what to do with it and how to affect behavioral change or organizational change. So I have these data, I have these results, and then they say, now what? So perhaps each of you can comment in closing. You have this wonderful partnership, you develop some great results, and then now what? This is what I would call the data glut. People are really good at generating data or downloading mounds and mounds of data, but it takes a real scientific or at least entrepreneurial eye to figure out how should we best use those data to affect organizational change. Panelists, And again, this is another challenge. You can tell that I'm a tough moderator here. These are questions that the three panelists did not know that these questions would be coming. So let's start with
So
Anya.
Sure. So I think once you've collected data, the first thing you can do is look at treatment effects, which is basically we have an intervention and we have some kind of new solicitation. We look at the effect of that different intervention on donations, and then the charity can say, look, when we do the matches in this certain way versus this other way, it will be more effective. But a bigger kind of more overarching question is then why did we see that result? So it's not enough just to do an A/B test and say we sent a blue letter and a red letter and we see more people respond to the blue letter. Once we can come up with a theory in which we organize behavior and our predictions for behavior in the way that I described in my talk with objectives and constraints, we can start thinking about how the findings actually can generalize to other settings, can generalize to other future solicitation campaigns.
Okay. Robert?
Yeah, so in addition to what Anya said, we are used to working with charities and organizations, partnering with them to do these types of experiments. And I think what I find personally useful is going into that organization after the experiment has been done, once we've got the data, once we've got the treatment effects, as Anya said, that we then present the information in a way that's easy to understand to the whole organization. So we're very upfront about what our hypotheses were, and then we actually say what actually happened. And as Anya said, figuring out why it actually happened, and just making sure that everyone in the charity understood with you as an individual, when you take a risk in going off and doing an experiment, we want to support you and give you all the evidence that you need then to, within your organization, to motivate other people to do experiments.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah. So I think to add on to what Anya was saying, I think her answer is very good. That there's a tendency that a lot of experimentation, a lot of the early experiments that people were doing were things that were saying the equivalent of A/B testing, saying we have this idea, we want to test, is strategy 1 more effective than strategy 2? And at the end you learn that strategy 1 is more effective, but you don't know why, then it is a lot harder to take action upon that information with it. So I would say that taking a step back and starting from the position of saying the aim of the experimentation or the aim of what you're doing is to find out what makes your donors tick, so that we have information at the end that is actionable, that we could say, moving forward, what is the most effective way to approach our donors to meet our objectives, whether that's to get more donors coming in, to increase dollars given, whatever your objective is. Starting off with designing the experiment, saying these are the questions that are going to be of most importance for the organization, for this nonprofit at the end, and this is what will be actionable for them, and designing the experiment that way. Rather than starting from an ex-ante design where it's saying, I just want to test the relative effectiveness of these two strategies, and I don't know why one works better than the other. Starting saying, if we are interested in these two strategies, let's set it up, the experiment, not only that I test the effectiveness of it, but I understand by adding subtle things to the experiment itself, additional manipulations, to uncover why one is more effective than the other. And then that's easier to sit down and talk with the head of development or the CEO of it and saying, not only did we find this is how it worked, that this strategy worked better, here's why it works better, and here's how you can act upon that in the future to increase dollars coming in. Mm-hmm. So it's starting with what is the set of questions to ask up front, and it's starting with a theory and uncovering what motives are and saying that's the aim of it, rather than to just do a reduced form, is the red letter better than the blue letter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That was excellent. So I want to close by mentioning this is just the first event of a very busy 3 days here at SPI. Tomorrow and Saturday we will have many speakers from all over the world come to the University of Chicago and tell us about their research in which SPI has partly and sometimes entirely funded. So I want all of you, if you're interested in joining the live stream conference over the next few days, you're welcome to come to our website and watch that conference. It promises to be very exciting. We have Chuck Longfield, who's sitting in here today. He will be giving the dinner time talk. We have practitioners and academics who have thought hard about issues surrounding the economics of charity, and they will be presenting many fascinating studies that are both lab experiments, field experiments, and as well as some new economic theory into the issue of philanthropy and the economics of charity. So you're all certainly welcome to join us. Finally, I would like to thank the panelists. They all did just a super job summarizing in only 20 minutes what they find to be important recent research that SPI has been engaging in. Is just tremendously hard, but it's very fruitful. I very much appreciate your time and consideration. And also in answering my questions and the questions of the audience. I think you've been good sports about it. You've been maybe surprised by a few of the questions, but that's all part of the inquiry behind SPI. So in closing, I want to thank the people who have spent the last 2 hours with us. You're troopers, and I look forward to working with all of you to learn about the science of philanthropy. Thank you very much.